And, you know, I will acknowledge to schools that can be hard because, again, we don't have a good definition of what sufficient time is. And the eligibility timeline is 60 school calendar days. Is that enough for response to intervention? It's hard to say, but we can't use that timeline to deny an evaluation. So we need to be collecting multiple sources of data. So what is pretty clear from our state's SLD eligibility guidance document on page 17 is that when designing an RTI framework, an essential component is to involve the parents as partners in process. And they give some guiding questions to consider. So we need to make sure that we talk to parents about, you know, how their child has been identified as needing intervention, involve them in the development, implementation, and monitoring of the intervention, communicate with them about their students' progress, communicate with them about the continuum of supports available through RTI, and provide them with strategies to implement at home, and celebrate with them, right, as their child makes growth. And this can be hard to do from a school perspective, right, during a busy school day, you know, especially when parents are also busy, right, and working during school hours. But we need to kind of be doing our best to kind of involve parents in the process. So for RTI, the pros are that we get kids evidence-based support when they need it. We're aware that there may be a concern early. And eligibility really is kind of based on evaluating symptoms and impairment in real time. The cons are that although this is not the intention, what can happen is that kids can hang out in tiers without documentation to follow them. So let's say, you know, we have a kid hanging out at tier 2 for the whole school year, and then they move to a different school, right, the next year. The new school doesn't know that the kid was hanging out in tier 2 for the whole school year. Or, you know, let's say that they're, you know, moved in the middle of the year. You know, the new school doesn't necessarily know exactly all the processes that were going on in the previous school, whereas an IEP has to follow the child. And so too, like when we think about, you know, kids transitioning from school to school, it's important to involve parents so parents can help communicate that information that, like, you know, hey, this is the services the kid was receiving at their previous school. But then we also need to think about, you know, how schools communicate when students transfer. And, you know, as a school psychologist and person working in the school, sometimes kids would come into the school with, you know, no information really. Or sometimes kids would they would be at school one day and then they leave and be gone the next, right? And so if kids are part of an RTI process, it doesn't easily follow them from school to school. Hopefully all schools are implementing RTI well and would be able to catch the child and figure it out and do what needs to be done. But we know that in practice, that's not always the case. And RTI does require we implement a system, and implementing a system in a school is very hard work and it takes a lot of time. So when we're left with two rigid choices, you know, it's kind of a conundrum sometimes. The easy choice is the ability and achievement discrepancy. That's really easy, but it's not the best choice. Yet the best choice is kind of a bear to get off the ground. You can't just decide like, oh, we're going to do RTI now. Like, that's really hard to do. So what's the consensus on the definition of a learning disability? This is why you're confused. There's not great consensus. So what are you supposed to do with that? Data. Gather multiple different points of data, and hopefully through those multiple sources of data, you'll be able to demonstrate a consistent pattern. So data are my favorite. Again, data's my favorite. Data are, but anyway. So just data, right? And if you're make sure that your attendance is that kids' attendance is consistent. You don't want the argument to be lack of appropriate instruction because the kid was not at school. So we need to make sure attendance is consistent. We need to further assess vision, hearing, and motor skills. And I will tell you, I did not really learn how to read well until the 2nd grade because I was seeing double for 2 years. It's pretty hard to learn to read when everything is double. And so finally we got that figured out and straightened out and things were fine. And I now have a PhD, but we need to also, rule out vision factors. We need to assess for ADHD and mood disorders. The co-occurrence between ADHD and specific learning disabilities is about 50%. If you have one neurodevelopmental disorder, it's much more likely you're going to have another. So we need to make sure that, we're addressing ADHD and mood disorders. And again, it's a chicken and egg problem with mood disorders. If you are persistently underachieving, it would make sense that you would feel anxious and depressed, right? Or it would make sense that you would act out, right? Having internalizing and externalizing problems would make sense if you're having a really hard time at school. And that deserves to be treated as well. So don't be afraid to ask for data to be explained, for information about the core curriculum, for behavioral observation in the classroom, and then also for assessment by a school mental health professional. And I will say for teachers, because I know there are some teachers out there listening as well, I think sometimes for teachers, sometimes they feel like, RTI kind of falls on their shoulders, right? And you have a classroom of 28 kids who you have to differentiate instruction for, and then you need to find a way to kind of implement some evidence-based interventions for a few particular kids in your classroom who are also struggling. And that's a really tall order too, right? So we also need to be thinking about, when we're implementing RTI, what kind of supports are we providing and implementing these interventions? Because it's not fair to either ask teachers to be doing this really all on their own either, or what kind of supports are we providing teachers in terms of gathering and monitoring and assembling data. And we'll argue again, put a plug for school psychologists. School psychologists are trained to do all this. And if we had the appropriate ratio in our state, they would be able to better support teachers. But the ideal ratio is about, I think, 1 to 500. And I think in Kentucky, we're lucky if it's 1 to 1,000 as far as the ratio for school psychologists to students. So anyway, there's my double reading example, right? Or double vision reading, right? So if words look like that to you on a page, are you going to look at the words or are you going to be looking at the pictures instead? So we do need to rule out vision as well. An optometrist may not pick up as well on this as an ophthalmologist. So if there are reading difficulties, it's worthwhile to pursue an evaluation by an ophthalmologist. Okay, so ADHD and specific learning disorders, comorbidity rates are high, especially with written expression, because of all the attention processes that are involved in being able to write well. So where are we going to see overlap and where are we going to see differences? So with both ADHD and a learning disability, we're going to see kids avoiding academic tasks. And that avoidance can range from simple refusal to outright tantrums and ripping up paper and flipping desks. You can see behavioral outbursts during academic tasks. We'll see impairment in rate of learning. We may see poor reading comprehension, poor written expression, poor math problem solving. There's both academic pieces and attentional pieces involved in all of those skills. If a kid has ADHD, we will also see some inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity in settings beyond the classroom or beyond academics or beyond homework. So we'll see impairment beyond just the academic setting. You'll also often see social impairment because you need a bit of attention in order to be able to interact with people effectively. You have to be able to pay attention to nonverbal cues. You have to know when to stop. You have to know the right time to make jokes. So we may also see social impairment in kids with ADHD, and kids with ADHD will often You know, you'll see them rushing through activities where a kid with a learning disability may be working very slowly and laboriously. A kid with a learning disability, once behavior is modified, they'll still have difficulty and a slow rate of learning. Limited phonemic awareness is kind of authentic to a learning disability. Limited ability to complete math calculations, poor spelling, slower processing speed, maybe characteristics more of learning disability. So when you're thinking about gathering data, this is a helpful way to kind of make sure you're gathering all the pieces. I like using this table. It's called a Riot ISIL. So we review the instruction, the curriculum, what's going on in the environment, what's going on with the learner. We interview the teachers. It's hard to really interview a curriculum, but we interview people maybe involved in the child's environment, inside of school, outside of school. We talk to the child about what their experience is like. We observe instruction being delivered. We observe the learner in multiple environments. We, you know, test kind of how the child is performing based on certain criteria, or we may give standardized tests. So I think kind of using this this framework is a helpful kind of graph and guide to kind of make sure that we're really effectively triangulating data and we are looking at all the different pieces of data that we need to be looking at. All right, so as far as eligibility timeline goes, if you're concerned about a learning disability and you want to go through the special education evaluation process. So there's a request for evaluation. There's a meeting within 10 days. At that meeting, it's discussed if there needs to be an evaluation and what areas need to be evaluated. Ideally, at that meeting, there is data. Again, no data, no meeting. We need to kind of make sure that we're bringing data to the table to kind of argue for what needs to be assessed and why. And the parents give consent for an evaluation. After that consent, there is 60 school calendar days for the school psychologist to complete that evaluation. And if you are a school psychologist with 100 evaluations or more to complete within a school year, you are going to most certainly take every one of those 60 school calendar days because that is the only way you can survive. And that 60 school calendar days is affected by snow days, right? So if school's out, that adds a day in. It's affected by Christmas break. It's affected by summer break. So it's school calendar days, not calendar days. Also, you know, if we're going through an RTI process during the evaluation, right, we're also going to need those full 60 school calendar days to be able to implement interventions and measure response. Then we have a meeting to determine whether or not the child is eligible for special education. If they are found eligible, then there's another 30 school calendar days the school has to kind of draft the IEP, and then we come back and meet to kind of develop the IEP. Now, most schools I've been in don't take those extra 30 school calendar days because most places don't want to have an extra meeting, right? So usually, you know, there is a drafted IEP at the eligibility determination meeting, although technically, right, that, I mean, if you're thinking kind of in terms of how things work, that, you know, you determine eligibility as a team and then you discuss what might be included in the IEP. But sometimes what happens is you have kind of people within the school discussing what the eligibility decision might be before the parent is at the meeting and then drafting what might be included in the IEP. And so if you come to that determination of eligibility meeting with a drafted IEP, it's hard too, as the parent, to be like, well, you know, I'm not so sure I agree with that, or I want things to look a little different in this way, or, you know, what about this? So you either have the additional 30 school calendar days or you get it all done at once, and it can be kind of a challenge. Can you jump the line? So I mean, the timeline is a process, right? And I have parents coming into our clinic and talking to our pediatricians in the clinic, asking if Dr. Briggs can evaluate them, you know, because it takes so long within the school setting. And no, I can't help you jump the line. That's not how it works. I understand the urgency. I understand the want to get this done. I understand wanting to have services for your kid. I'm a parent as well. I get that. But what happens is, let's say, you know, I do an evaluation and I provide an outside report. That outside report enters the timeline at the request for the evaluation point. Then the school considers my report or the outside report, for example, and determines whether they want to evaluate. Most often, the school's going to want to collect some additional data. At a minimum, right, they're going to want to do some behavior observations of the kid in the classroom if it hasn't been done. So it could be that the school is going to want to do, you know, the ARC team is going to decide that they want more data, and there's going to be an evaluation process, which then starts the 60 school calendar days. So it could be that you have that meeting and the school says, oh, this report is lovely. It has everything we need and we can proceed to eligibility. But as a school psychologist who's received outside reports, I think the outside reports that I've gotten that have been that lovely have kind of been few and far between. And usually it's been the case I've wanted to collect additional data. And I would say even when I do test kids in the clinic, I mean, yes, it's a piece of information, but I wholeheartedly support the school in collecting additional data in their context as well. Okay, so here we're getting back to an independent evaluation. So if a parent disagrees with the evaluation, they have a right to an independent evaluation. This can be at their own expense, or it can be at the public expense. If it's going to be at the public expense, you're going to likely be initiating due process to have it at the public expense. And you have one shot at an independent evaluation. In the independent evaluation has to use the same methods that the school uses in a way. So if the school uses RTI, the independent evaluation also has to be able to use an RTI process. So with a learning disability, an independent evaluation is, many parents may want it because of how convoluted the diagnosis is, but it may be a challenge. And it fits in the timeline kind of, you know, after the determination of eligibility, then you get the independent evaluation, and there's really no timeline set around that. Then once that independent evaluation is done, then you go back to determination of eligibility. Okay, if as a parent you want to request an evaluation, I recommend you do it in writing, and I recommend you put some thought into it and provide some data as to why you're concerned. As a former school psychologist, do not go to your pediatrician and ask for a prescription for an IEP. Your school psychologist will cry. Don't do that. Those used to drive me crazy. But a well thought out letter, right, I think is valuable. And I think it's easier for this to translate to a specific request than a verbal request. So I recommend kind of doing a request in writing. And this is just a model I have. There are lots and lots of resources in terms of response to intervention. The IRIS Center has a wealth of modules and information. National Center on RTI as well. The What Works Clearinghouse is where you can go to find evidence-based interventions, as well as Intervention Central is where you can go to find free curriculum-based measurement and evidence-based interventions. This book, Effective School Interventions, which is now in its 3rd edition, is what I consider a Bible for evidence-based interventions. So if you're a teacher or a school psychologist, I recommend taking a look at that. Rights Law is a website that provides legal information in parent-friendly language. If you're within Kentucky, I highly recommend reading both the Guide to Systems of Intervention and the Specific Learning Disability Guidance document. And those are references. And that is it. So 8 minutes for questions. I'm sure there's a lot because of how this works. Yes.
We have a question from an online participant. Her name is Caroline. Do you have any suggestions for how best to meet the needs of my college students with learning disabilities, those who identify but don't have an accommodation letter?
Well, as far as college students go, my experience is that different colleges, colleges has offices of students with disabilities. Each college has an office like that. And different colleges have different guidelines in terms of what they require for documentation of a learning disability. It's been my experience that some colleges require an adult intelligence test and a measure of academic achievement. So in terms of documentation of a learning disability, to kind of look at what the specific college guidelines are for where that student will be going would be important. And then as far as kind of getting that assessment and diagnosis, we do that within, adolescent medicine in terms of getting that data for them. In terms of interventions, different colleges, again, have different resources. I know University of Kentucky has a wide variety of different resources for students with disabilities, kind of above and beyond accommodations, whereas some other schools really just have, do you have a documented disability? Do you have accommodations? And that's really kind of it. And what accommodations are helpful really vary. My husband has some kids who have are allowed to record lectures, for example, as an accommodation, or be able to use audiobooks or text to speech kind of things. Here's your question, or Caroline's question.
I think it does.
Okay.
I think it does.
Any other?
Oh, I have so many questions. So I didn't know if you just wanted to wait until after all of the recording stuff, because I just have so much. But I guess one that I could throw out now. So I know you talked about the developmental age of inversions. And so to me, that's inversions, transpositions, any of those. So in your opinion, what age is that no longer developmentally appropriate?
Gosh, that's hard to say exactly. I can tell you that my kindergartner does it, and it does not worry me at all, because that would be pretty expected for a kindergartner or, even a first grader. Once you're getting more towards third grade, it really shouldn't be happening as much. But I don't have any studies to cite for you specifically on that. But I can tell you kindergarten, first grade, from my experience, that's pretty typical.
And just to follow up on that a little bit, do you think that there is a reason, from what I understand, a lot of districts in Kentucky won't even educate their teachers on how to identify dyslexia until third grade, when it has been proven that it can be identified with 90% accuracy as early as age 5.5? So they're only delaying that intervention.
I think.
So do you know why that is, or if
I think it depends on what model the district is operating from. If they're operating from an ability achievement discrepancy model, I can understand why they would wait until third grade, right? Because you wouldn't necessarily expect to see a huge gap in ability achievement until a later grade. If they're operating on an RTI model, I don't have a good answer for that. But yes, the earlier we intervene, the earlier we find a problem and do something about it, the better the chance the kid has for not having a lifelong disability.
Do you often see high IQs correlated with specified learning disabilities?
I
Or
mean,
is it?
yeah, I mean, I've seen high IQs with learning disabilities. I've seen lower IQs with learning disabilities. So, yeah. And again, like but I have seen as a high school special school psychologist that, some kids with higher IQs don't necessarily, they're able to compensate for it until the demands get high. You have an online question?
I've encouraged the student, I've encouraged the students, I've encouraged the participants online to ask a question in the chat box. And I did that in the chat box, so I typed it up, but I'm actually, they can hear me now. So, I mean,
yeah. If
you got a question, please, for our presenter, please feel free to ask it in the chat box. We haven't had a question other than Caroline's.
Okay.
In the chat box.
Well, I'm happy to share my email too. Which is just my first name dot my last name at uky.edu. And my parents had to be different, and they spelled Alyssa with an I, because they didn't want to do the Y because that was too common.
Do you have any research that shows any of the causations, correlations between, I guess, the causes of specified learning disability, or do you have any research showing that fetal drug use is a cause of specified learning disability?
In terms of research I'm familiar with, there is some research out there documenting that there are a couple of distinct processes in the brain that can be related to dyslexia. One to kind of more difficulty with decoding, and one more to difficulty with comprehension. In terms of prenatal drug use, our higher order thinking and our executive functioning is the most at risk, right? So when we drink alcohol, our executive functions are the first thing to go, right? We lose our inhibition, we lose our concentration, we lose our ability to, pay attention while we drive. When people get dementia, right, their executive functions, their memory, their attention is one of the first things to go. When we're exposed to drugs during our development, either prenatally or even based on some of the choices we may make as adolescents, right, our executive functions are more likely to be impaired. They're the most sensitive in a way, right? Or even if you get a concussion, right, you'll experience impairment in concentration and working memory. So along those lines, it makes complete sense to me that prenatal drug use would relate to an increase in like ADHD, for example, and other neurodevelopmental disorders.
So any other causes
that I'm aware of? They're highly genetic. So, if you have a relative with a learning disability, it's much, more likely that you will have one. And neurodevelopmental disorders in general are genetic. ADHD, learning disabilities, autism, all of those are, if you have a relative with one, you're much more likely to have one yourself. So there may be some genetic factors or even epigenetic factors, but, even that's hard to tease out. So let's say, you have a learning disability in reading and you have a child, you may be less likely to read to that child. So may that lead to differences in their ability to learn to read. So.
We don't have any other questions online.
Okay.
I'd like to thank Dr. Briggs for sharing her time and experience with us today.
Sure. All right, thanks.
Thank you.
And I could really talk for hours. Oh, I just went ahead and closed that because that's just what I'm used to do, but I don't know if that's what I was supposed to do.
That's okay.
That's fine. Okay.